So good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. I welcome you all. Today we will be discussing about multilateral diplomacy. We have our speaker from Greece, Ms. Rania Lampou. I would like to introduce Ms. Rania and then we will move forward. Ms. Rania, she is from Greece, global educator and STEM instructor, as well as she works at the Greek Ministry of Education and Religious Affairs, Directorate of Educational Technology and Innovation, STEM Education and Neuroeducation. And she has also received many national and international awards. I will not, announce the names of all those awards, but I mean there are bundles of awards which she received in many conferences in Greece as well as in other countries as well. So, Ms. Rania, thank you very much for joining us today. I would like to give the floor to you so you can talk about, you can discuss about multilateral diplomacy with our participants. Thank you very much. And Ms. Rania, the floor is yours.
Greetings from Greece to all participants. I'm very, very honored and thank you very much for your kind invitation. So today we're going to explore different aspects of multilateralism. Means that we're going to explore, to discuss about multilateral diplomacy. So may I share my presentation?
Yes, please. You can share your presentation. Yes, we can see.
Now?
Yes, we can see.
So there has been a radical change in the world's way of conducting everyday business and interactions. Demands and expectations made on governments by the people and even by international organizations can no longer be satisfied through isolated and self-contained efforts. The reason is that both private and public non-state actors have tracked alongside national governments in setting and implementing new agendas. And this interconnectivity is the reason why there is such a push for multilateralism. Borders and national frontiers are increasingly becoming less relevant in defining the flow of ideas, with modern communication changing the world altogether as we are now well into the information age. However, this presents a challenge for security, where terrorism, arms, disease, and drugs may seep through borders practically unchallenged. In order to find the solutions for problems, there must be, in all phases, active participation of local governments, NGOs, and the private sector. Alarm has been raised on the international scene as globalization is considered to be a process of erosion to the legitimacy and effectiveness of national governments, which has resulted in the decline of support for international organization. The solution, however, to many of the problems is indeed global governance. Of course, this is not the creation of a world government, but a level of international decision makers between governments and international organizations. We have presented the example of the United Nations being the most suitable candidate for such a role. The United Nations has both a moral legitimacy, political credibility, and administrative impartiality to mediate, moderate, and reconcile the tensions associated with both the process and outcomes of globalization. So in today's world, the threat of a global war remains fresh in the memory of humanity after the end of the Cold War. The world where major position and a widely shared view among like-minded states has emerged. And this vision is ultimately one of global governance, or at the very least an effective multilateral body designed to tackle the problems faced by the world today. So multilateral diplomacy can be defined as the management of international relations by negotiations among 3 or more states through diplomatic or governmental representatives. And this combines coordinated diplomatic interactions of more than 2 actors with action within the framework of international organizations oriented towards the principles and norms and carried out in accordance with the rules and regulations that underlie those organizations. In this version, a multilateral foreign policy stands not only for a specific diplomatic approach, but also for a commitment to certain principles, substantive goals and methods of foreign policy, and for underlying set of values. Multilateralism is the term used to describe cooperation among states. It is an approach based on the premise that by working together, countries can find solutions to common problems without renouncing their sovereignty. Multilateralism refers to foreign and security policies that seek to establish, maintain, and further develop a specific international order through specific forms of international diplomacy. The order may be the currently liberal international order, but it could also be another quite different order that would be based on a different ideology, although it would also be promoted multilaterally. Diplomacy has actually expanded, according to Kofi Annan, the former UN secretary, has expanded its remit, moving far beyond bilateral political relations between states into a multilateral, multifaceted enterprise encompassing almost every realm of human endeavor. And multilateral diplomacy is guided by some key principles of international order. International organizations have set up agreements and they try to perform certain functions to deliver certain global goods for the benefits of all. So multilateralism operates through global and regional institutions, norms, frameworks, summits. The rules and procedures defining have the mandate and legitimacy to conduct negotiations. All these are very well established. So multilateral diplomacy serves multiple functions. It serves as the parliament of man, as we say, like UN General Assembly or Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change, and sets also aspirational goals for humanity, like the UN and Millennium Development Goals or Sustainable Development Goals. We all know the Agenda 2030 of UN for Sustainable Development Goals. It's the most hot issue nowadays. UN Convention on Children and Women serves to negotiate international treaties that improve the states of the world, and two examples stand out. Firstly, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and also UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Regulation of the banks for ensuring the stability and sustainability of world economic, and also the fact that some failures of multilateral diplomacy at global level compensated by success at the regional level. However, multilateral diplomacy is a complex phenomenon, and this means that it needs skillful leadership. Like this one, a characteristic example is Ambassador Tomikov of Singapore, when he managed actually to lead the UN Convention of the Law of Sea by making successful the conclusion despite many difficulties. And we all know, of course, about the advantages, how cooperation can provide a political environment conducive to easy bilateral progress, multilateral arrangements, and how means can be used to achieve states' objectives, both in direct and indirect manner, and how multilateral negotiations tend to broaden their agenda in order to take better account of the different objectives and interests of the parties involved. It's interesting to see a historical approach. The main efforts that the national community has taken in the past to minimize the national conflict are when we can see the Congress of Vienna, the concept of Europe, the League of Nations and the United Nations. The Congress of Vienna would be the first attempt that the national community took to formalize a long-term peace treaty in Europe, and it technically was not a congress, but merely a preliminary meeting of superpowers to discuss a future peaceful route for the continent. The main objective was peace, and this was achieved through the settlement of key issues that cropped up in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. It was an attempt to maintain the status quo. And it was actually during the Paris Peace Conference of 1990 and 1920 that a new type of institutionalized mechanism was established for states to interact with one another. It's what we call the Universal Membership Organization. The first such organization was the League of Nations, founded in 1920, which was replaced in 1945. After the Second World War, multilateralism became synonymous with a liberal international order based on Western concepts of the national relations, an order that is now being increasingly challenged. So the aftermath of World War has made multilateral diplomacy become a major talking point for many. The 21st century has brought about a huge change in the world of international relations, and along with the beginning of the rise of peace and human rights, the last quarter century has been one of extraordinary growth. Every area has flourished: politics, technology, economics, globalization, along with the good, has brought about a lot of new issues: global warming, non-renewable resources, flow of information, international trade, weapons of mass destruction, disease control, such as COVID or current Ebola outbreak. And also how multilateral cooperation is absolutely necessary, as only collectively can these matters be solved. That's why multilateralism has become a widespread and significant phenomenon. Of course, this has challenged. Of course, as an expert said, that the national cooperation is a tricky animal. Even where there is a will, there is often no clear way. So the new diplomatic era started after the First World War, when the national relationship became worldwide. Early signs of multilateral diplomacy came in the peace conference in 1815. However, much more significant implementation was later in 1945. So the United Nations Charter gave a way for multilateral diplomacy to begin and develop. Apart from the UN, of course, we have the World Health Organization, which is also a universal membership organization. And also, it's interesting to see how also non-governmental organizations have blossomed tremendously since the beginning of the 21st century. The rate is increasing. And into the second decade of the 21st century, which depicts a change within the major components of modern diplomacy. This development helped to grow a new norm within the international system, especially within the United Nations, and NGOs are now considered to be an important element within state-society relationships, and most of this emerged during times of conflict. And many times it's NGOs are considered to be as a tracker to diplomacy. Governments at times may be too rigid and also too complex to spend any time to address certain issues. Therefore, in some cases like this, it is within the government's interest to sanction work by NGOs on their behalf. There are many advantages to this. NGOs, especially within a conflict zone, are looked at with less suspicious eyes. Secondly, they actually cut costs for the government willing to operate in the area. And thirdly, they would be able to spend a large amount of time improving and understanding the situation in the field. So it would be best to look at more tangible examples of the success of NGOs in recent history, because they have successfully promoted the threats of our environment is facing, and all that pressure has led states to act on issues such as climate change. And another concept which is related to multilateral diplomacy, it's very important, it's the importance of legitimacy. Which is actually the belief that the rule, institution, or leader has the right to govern. Henry Kissinger once defined the diplomacy as a specific method for compromise and consensus, and a system of organization within a legitimate international order. So in both international affairs and domestic politics, a mandate is the authority granted by a constituency organization to act as its representative. Legitimacy depends on the perception among both constituents and observers that this authority is being exercised appropriately. Even ever since its inception, multilateral diplomacy had set itself apart from the often secretive diplomacy of the past through a commitment to transparency modeled on parliamentary practice. Formal legitimacy no longer tends to be sufficient to justify a system of governance. Moral legitimacy and results-based legitimacy are playing an even more important role, especially in global health. For multilateral organizations, also legitimacy is critical because it defines whether they continue to be the main platform for states' efforts to coordinate policies and solve problems, affects their ability to develop new rules and norms that are accepted broadly, and has a bearing on their ability to ensure compliance with international rules and norms. And legitimacy is also related to fundamental normative concerns. If international organizations their processes lack legitimacy in society, this contributes to a sense of democratic deficit and a lack of trust in global governance. It is necessary to think about what actually constitutes legitimacy, especially in the age of social media, in which moral legitimacy is so important. And in this context, a new type of legitimacy is derived from the representation and involvement of a large number of stakeholders. Legitimacy is undermined if an organization does not reflect the diversity of its constituency. If it fails to recruit, for an example, more women professionals from the global south, also for senior positions. And another key issue is the level of interdependence and authority organization by its member. For example, there are increasing calls for the World Health Organization to be granted a stronger mandate by its member states, especially in relation to health security. So the decision-making procedures of international organizations are continually being questioned, as are their transparency and their representativeness. Why do we need, of course, the dimension of the challenges that we have to face, diffuse distribution of power and principle of sovereignty, the potential of shaping multilateralism, and very important, why do we need multilateral foreign policy, is that it's about information gathering and pooling, joint projects, managing the external environment, influencing behavior, mutually beneficial deals, domestic agendas. Why? Because coordinating joint projects is often an effective way of achieving your own objectives. And states have recognized its advantages. States have joined forces in order to embark on ambitious deals on security, and also they have seen many promising results. And coordinating projects is the obvious approach in order to tackle the issue. What are the challenges now? This is, I think, the most important. What are the disadvantages? First of all, multilateralism is more protracted and costly than bilateral agreements or a unilateral octroi. While the results of multilateral agreement are generally broad and wide, they may not be more effective in responding to the problem at hand because they are characterized by compromises and lowest common denominators. And usually, urgent problems require rapid action that can be better tackled by a small number of actors who are willing and able to move forward. And also, in acute crisis, there are many disadvantages of multilateralism. And other inherent difficulties are the well-known problems of collective action. And this situation resembles the classic game, what we call game theory prisoner's dilemma, in which the best situation to a conflict for all involved cannot be realized due to the absence of trust. In the worst case scenario, multilateralism can nurture illusions, such as the illusion that, for example, that the world is making progress on military disarmament because multinational negotiations are dealing with it. And in some cases, this has been a situation for decades, as with the Geneva Conference on Disarmament, which has not produced any significant results for over 20 years. So in general, also, it is difficult to sanction violations of international agreements. And what is very important is observation, monitoring, and review mechanisms can be set up to improve the chances of successful implementation. International assistance can also be provided for corresponding national implementation measures, where such possibility and exists and the support is also accepted. And there's some also challenges. There must be a consensus about the foundation, concrete context of diplomacy. What is at stake? What ends are to be achieved? What interests and values are to be accommodated and how? And what concepts of international order will be promoted? None of this can be contested or controversial. And the second is about concerns interorganization implementation. Even when there is a broad agreement on principles, values, and goals, we have necessary but not yet sufficient preconditions for effective multilateralism, because cooperation within the framework of the Paris Convention climate policy demonstrates this, for example. It is based on principles, standards, and procedures. Yet multilateral climate policy, we all know that is far from slowing global warming to the desired and necessary extent. So the specific problems and limitations of multilateral action are need here to mention. Another example is in the 1981, the United Nations Security Council was totally deadlocked over the selection of the next Secretary General because the Permanent Five used the power of the veto formally and more often informally to sabotage, actually, to distort the decision-making procedure of the Council. So many times leaders put national interest ahead of global interest. And we have also another big challenge, power shifts from west to south. You all know about this. Non-state actors, another challenge. And of course, we all know about the Israel-Palestine issue. So what are the conditions that we have an effective multiculturalism? So the first important concern, the parties involved in their attitude, do they share a genuine interest in sustainable results, or does their participation in the multilateral negotiation merely serve tactical goals? Is there willingness to compromise? Is there willingness to act on the basis of diffuse reciprocity? And further prerequisites concern legitimacy of the negotiators and their ability to make binding commitments on behalf of those they represent, as well as organizational arrangements for the successful implementation of commitments made. If these conditions are not met, there is a risk that multilateral diplomacy will be unable to achieve anything positive and may even harmful. Risks include agreements that prove unworkable. For instance, the UN protection zones in the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s, or are irrelevant because they ignore the real problems, such as the Munich Agreement of 1938, which did nothing to stop Hitler's war preparation. So such agreements risk damaging the perception, reputation, credibility. In the worst case scenario, also, multilateral negotiations can be tactically misused as smoke screens to conceal unilateral power politics. And of course, the disadvantages of multilateralism can be mitigated, perhaps even eliminated by appropriate procedures, as well as the parties involved behave constructively and are willing to compromise. Essential for getting there is wise and effective political leadership, and their leadership tasks, including structuring and advancing the agenda with a view to achieving effective results, ensuring that deadlines are met and that progress is made as quickly as possible. In this context, it becomes clear that even a foreign policy that is consistently multilateral in orientation must also at times incorporate unilateral action, above all intensive bilateral diplomacy in order to make effective multilateralism possible. So in general, it is difficult to imagine how coalitions could be successfully forged or crises overcome in negotiation processes without intensive bilateral diplomacy. However, bilateralism is certainly problematic for multilateral diplomacy when it is not treated as a component of good multilateralism, but rather as an alternative to it. There must be a consensus about the normative foundations, and we all know about also United Nations challenges, because while the European Union is considered to be the almost perfect example of regional harmony, the United Nations is the best example of global multilateralism. While it still has its flaws, it is seen as a work in progress. In 2020, it celebrated 75 years. It's a so-called second experiment after the failure of the League of Nations, and represents the latest attempt at international cooperation to save the succeeding generation from the scourge of war. As it rose from the ashes of the Second World War, the United Nations was sidelined due to the USA-Soviet rivalry. However, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United Nations managed to assume a vital role in the national security, have managed to work to maintain the national peace and security in a very complex reality. What threatens global security nowadays are not traditional security threats, while the United Nations lists many success over this topic. And if the organization is not able to adapt, it will face an existential crisis. So this we also mentioned the Council, which is the organ which is held to the global security and peace. And despite the United Nations' best efforts, there are solutions such as the conflict in Syria and North Korean aggressiveness. And what about COVID during the COVID pandemic? By concluding, we can see that it had COVID pandemic a strong impact on the national diplomacy. Became clear that global cooperation is central to deal with the socioeconomic effects on global health crisis. And also, we have seen how it had impacted the work of diplomats. It forced diplomats to adapt their working methods and, of course, to organize many digital and virtual meetings. In a world, these world meeting conventions of the foreign policy have significantly changed. And of course, we can't replace interface in-person meetings in diplomacy. It's difficult, but they need to adapt in new normal. What we need, we have to, humanity needs a wake-up call. Obviously, we need to meet theoretical practices and above all, to change our mindset. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any question, I am to expose it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rania. It was a very informative discussion, and you discussed about everything, the historical background and pros and cons, the good part and what are the challenges also. So it was a very informative presentation. So if anyone would like to ask any question, they are more than welcome. Either they can write in the chat box or they can ask directly from Ms. Rania also. I think no one wanted to ask any kind of question because everything is very much clear to the participants also, and it was a very informative presentation. And thank you very much for your joining us on a very short notice, because I discussed with you that we are having some emergency situation and our speaker was he was very busy, so that is why. Thank you very much for joining, Ms. Rania. And thanks to all the participants, and thanks Ms. Narmeen for joining our session. She is from Azerbaijan, and she is her organization is cooperating with us, cooperating with Youth Diplomacy Forum. And thanks to all participants also. And we are ending up our session here, and good luck everyone. See you in next session. Thank you very much.